Welcome to the webinar, Culture as the Hidden Human-Centric Innovation Engine. My name is Alina Strugut, Research Director and Principal Analyst here at Lux Research, and I will be moderating today's session. Presenting today is my colleague, Cheryl Auger, Senior Director for the Consumer Insights team. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the questions box on your screen. Time permitting, we will answer all these questions, or as many as we can. And if your questions do not get answered, please don't hesitate to email to questions@luxresearchinc.com, and we will respond as soon as possible. If at any point you experience technical difficulties, such as a frozen screen, simply refresh your browser and check that your internet connection is strong. So let's jump into the presentation.
Thank you so much, Alina. I'm so excited to have an opportunity to talk today a little bit about how we can use culture in our innovation strategies. To kick us off, I wanted to share a recent headline that I came across. And as you can see, the headline is Why Gen Z Hates Work. And I've seen a number of headlines just like this one, little variation, Gen Z doesn't want to work, Gen Z is the hardest generation to manage, Gen Z is disengaged, and on like that. And you know, it's a pretty popular narrative, and it seems to make sense because it's so visible. But when I went in and looked at how Gen Z thinks about and talks about work in our virtual anthropologist platform, I discovered something really different. Gen Z consumers are talking about building side businesses. They're talking about monetizing creativity. Many are talking about managing multiple income streams, some because they want to, and others due to economic precarity, right? So when I look at how Gen Z is making meaning around work, we start to see a renegotiation rather than a dismissal. They're not rejecting work, but they're rejecting the idea that work should have unquestioned authority in our lives. In other words, they're looking for ways to create more work-life balance. So their meaning, or the meaning that they're making when it comes to work, is a bit different than what we see in that dominant or media narrative. And the question there is, how do we end up with these two completely different interpretations of the same generation? And the difference isn't just the data, it's how we're interpreting what we're seeing. And this pattern isn't only relevant when it comes to Gen Z, we also see it when it comes to sustainability or DEI for that matter, right? And so there's a gap between what's most visible, what's taking place in the visible narrative, and the deeper beliefs, the deeper ways that people are making meaning in their lives. And why this is important for us is because that gap is a place where strategic decisions can start to go wrong, right? So this isn't just a media narrative problem. It's a problem around misinterpreting and misunderstanding culture, misunderstanding people for that matter. And when we misunderstand people, their deep motivations, their beliefs, and what things mean in their lives, we risk making poor strategic decisions, right? So as I said, the issue isn't a lack of information. We have more information than ever, but we sometimes rely on the wrong signals or we misinterpret what we're seeing. We have a tendency to measure what's loud, what's visible, what's easy to capture, right? And sometimes we mistake that for cultural direction. But visibility is not the same as trajectory. We need to avoid mistaking volume for truth. I understand that the loudest perspectives often travel furthest, but culture doesn't move at the speed of virility. It evolves through repetition, adaptation, and what quietly becomes normal over time. So when we design for what spikes, we risk missing out on what's actually stabilizing. And that's where innovation can fail. And it often fails at the level of meaning, not function. It's not about whether something works, though that's important, but what's really important is whether it feels relevant, credible, and worth adopting. So today, I want to reframe how we think about culture. And in particular, I want to think about culture as an input to innovation. So first, I'm going to talk about why it is that we have a tendency to misread or misinterpret culture. From there, I'm going to argue that meaning, not behavior, is what actually drives adoption. Although behavior is important, don't get me wrong. And then finally, I am going to discuss how we can identify what's stabilizing in culture and identify what's just noise. And I'm going to talk about how we can use this for innovation with two real examples from research my team has been doing on sustainability and DEI. Okay, so let's get into it. As I've said, we have more data than ever before. We have more dashboards, more signals. So the question here is, why do we keep getting culture wrong? Now, the problem isn't information scarcity, it's interpretive bias. Culture is easy to misunderstand. Honestly, it's so messy. There's tension, there's multiple trajectories at play. So it's a challenging thing to interpret and understand. Furthermore, as I've mentioned, many of the tools that we use, while they're important and helpful, they're often used really to focus on visibility. What's said most often, what's growing fastest, what's getting the most attention, right? But here's the thing, culture is shaped by what becomes shared and stable, right? So there are three consistent distortions at play that make it easier to misinterpret culture. And they include the fact that our algorithms amplify extremes. And even as researchers, we can fall prey to some of those echo chambers that we see online. Along those lines, aesthetics get mistaken for real change. We can think about fads like Labubu, for example. And furthermore, as a result of this, outrage is a lot more visible than adaptation. And as a result, we sometimes take stereotypes a little bit more seriously than we ought to. And that's not just in media, that is something we all need to watch out for. So together, these biases overrepresent volatility, they obscure stability. And as a result, it becomes easier to mistake noise for direction. We assume what's loud reflects where culture is going, but it often reflects where culture is concentrated, right? So again, why does this matter? Well, misreading culture can become a business problem because our cultural interpretations, our understanding of how people make meaning can shape or have an influence on our innovation decisions. That is what we build, what we prioritize, what we invest in. And if we misread culture, we're at risk of designing for what feels urgent and visible rather than what's actually truly stabilizing or meaningful in people's lives. And that's where we end up with innovations that look right, that have the functions and the features that are important, but they fail to land because they're not aligned with people's deeper beliefs. Right. So here it's really important to think about meaning. Meaning is important. It comes before behavior. And this is because most of us adopt products when that underlying cultural meaning becomes relevant and socially shared. Our product adoption is often a manifestation of our deeper beliefs and even our shared beliefs. So let's take a step back for a minute. At the heart of it, culture is how we make meaning. It's how we interpret change, negotiate identity, and decide what fits into our lives, right? So this is why it has a huge impact on whether something gets adopted or ignored. As I mentioned, if we stop at behavior, while it's really important to understand what people are doing, we sometimes miss out on the reason why they're doing it. Right? And this is because a lot of our tools do a great job explaining behavior, but they don't always do such a great job explaining why something feels right or wrong to people. And that's where we have an interpretive gap that can lead to problems in innovation, right? We need to have that full picture. We need to understand what people are doing, but we need that deeper why that comes from cultural analysis. And without that deeper why, without that important layer, we can't always explain what's happening, which also makes it hard to predict what's next. So at Lux, we have a solution. We have a set of tools that are all designed to help us get to that deeper why. We use digital ethnography, that is observational analysis designed to analyze how people express and negotiate ideas in real-world contexts. We study consumer behavior through large-scale analysis of the real conversations that consumers are having online, regardless of our observation, and we do this at scale, combining cultural anthropology with AI and natural language processing, which allows us to track how meaning is evolving over time, where ideas are fragmented, where they're still being debated, where there's not a lot of shared understanding, to where they begin to converge into shared understanding, right? So this convergence is really imperative in understanding where culture is headed and as an input into our innovation strategy, right? So we do this, as I mentioned, by decoding meaning, and cultural anthropology, ethnography, observational analysis are all really important methodologies in helping us to better understand culture and use it as an innovation input, right? So we do this, as I said, by decoding, analyzing full contextual analysis of millions of consumer conversations. We're not just tracking keywords or mentions, we're getting deeper to understand the hidden meanings, the underlying drivers that consumers associate with a topic, a trend, an idea, to help uncover that deeper why behind the behavior we're seeing. All right, so a few things are important here. One is context. Anthropology always teaches us that context matters. So we analyze those topics, the trends, the ideas through their relationships, not just in isolation. When we're looking at those conversations and we're doing that kind of discourse analysis, we look at each topic in context. It's part of a wider network of ideas. We look at how it relates to other concepts, emotions, as well as cultural narratives to decode how consumers construct meaning around that topic or trend rather than just measure engagement with it. From there, we want to understand people's deep beliefs. What's driving them? Why do they even care about a topic, a trend, or an issue? Right? So we decode those core beliefs, values, and motivations that shape the conversation in order to reveal the implicit drivers behind what people do, not just the surface activity. Lastly, I want to make an important note here. While we are using AI, and we've been using AI for years, we have an amazing team of cultural anthropologists who work with our clients to use tools like our virtual anthropologist to evaluate what those topics mean in the cultural context and discuss the implications. So we still have an amazing team of humans that help us to navigate meaning and change over time. An important way that we do this is through our maturity curve. Our maturity framework is really important in measuring how consistently a culture is understood, how consistently or how much shared meaning there is when it comes to a topic, a trend, or an issue. Right? So I want to be really clear here. I know this S-curve often takes us right back to that diffusion of innovation model, but we are not measuring product adoption. It's an important metric to have, just like the what, but we're getting to how clearly and consistently something is understood by consumers, no matter how much adoption there is, right? So what we're doing here is evaluating whether the meaning associated with a topic, a trend, an issue is fragmented, emerging, or widely shared. And we do this by examining how connected a topic is to other topics, whether the surrounding topics are big, mainstream, relevant to a lot of people, how diverse or concentrated the meanings are in culture, and how quickly and consistently we're seeing convergence into those shared and stable definitions. Importantly, we use 12 months worth of data to see how consistently meaning is evolving over time to track and size our topics. And this historical data allows us to see whether a topic is growing, whether it's resonating or connected to other topics, and whether it has staying power. Something we need to understand as we think about innovation. We divide this curve into 4 key sections to help us figure out what do we do with this information. And you can see when we're in the new idea stage, topics are fragmented. There's not a lot of shared meaning. They're still being debated, discussed. In some instances, it may not even be on consumers' radar just yet. It's pretty niche. As we see more convergence, we move into that early consensus stage of maturity where shared meanings are emerging, but they're quite flexible. There's not that overwhelming convergence or consensus. From there, we move to our mainstream, where they're starting to see convergence. People get the trend, expectations are being set, but there's still a little bit of wiggle room to shape those expectations. Whereas when we move into established ideas, at this stage, meanings are fixed. There's a lot of convergence, a lot of shared meanings, expectations are ingrained, and it's harder to shift people's perspective. We need to think about how to differentiate using marketing and communication. But at the end of the day, this approach is important to help us predict when ideas are ready for mainstream innovation, right? At the edge of that early consensus to the start of that mainstream acceptance is our peak area where we know that consumers are moving into a place where there's enough convergence for it to have mainstream interest, right? When our clients use this to help determine when are consumers ready for new solutions, does the market still need education? If we're seeing a lot of fragmentation, we might need to help to create some of that convergence. We use this to help identify when innovation opportunities are strongest. As I mentioned, as we're hitting that mainstream is a key time for most of our clients, whereas when we're hitting that established ideas, things are very mature. Innovation doesn't always lead to differentiation, and we do need to think hard about how to communicate around that. Let me give you a super quick example to bring this to life. Think about plant-based foods. 5 years ago, people talked about them in really different ways. They talked about health and ethics, identity, climate. Meanings were more fragmented than they are today. Today, even if adoption varies, most people understand or have some shared idea around what plant-based means, and many people will talk about meat alternatives and whole foods. Right? And that's a great example of how cultural maturity works. So again, when meanings stabilize, culture starts to become more predictable. And that's when innovation becomes less risky. So when we move beyond what's loud and we decode what's stabilizing or where there's convergence, cultural shifts come into focus differently. They're not just headlines, but evolving systems of meaning that have implication for our innovation strategy. Right? And here's the key thing. Having this predictability, understanding where culture is headed, helps to allow us to take a few more risks because that risk is less risky in a sense. It's more predictable. We understand where culture is headed. So this helps us to understand not just what to build, but when people are ready for it, what trade-offs they're willing to make, and what language is most relevant to consumers. So let me bring this to life. Let me bring this to life with 2 examples to move beyond theory to get into some practical applications. My first example I mentioned is DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in fact, in the United States right now, there's a lot of discussion about DEI, and it's pretty loud. But somewhat ironically, a lot of that discussion isn't actually about inclusion itself. It's about political backlash, legal scrutiny, and whether companies should even have these types of programs and policies at all. In other words, a lot of the discussion around DEI is about policies and programs. And of course, that still matters. Policies, programs are still very meaningful. But when we focus on how people are thinking about inclusion, we see that they're judging inclusion through everyday interactions. how decisions get made, how teams operate, how language is used in real life situations. And what's interesting is the idea of inclusion is very much mainstream, and many consumers are interested in increased cultural sensitivity, right? So what we're seeing stabilizing is something that's embedded in everyday life. And this is what I mean by the shift to cultural fluency. It's not just about knowing the rules, it's about navigating context, right? And so this is where the loudest voices can be misleading, right? The convergence we're seeing here exists in lived experiences as people are talking about daily behaviors, small ways to be more inclusive, small ways to signal belonging in everyday interactions. Now, as I mentioned, the overarching idea of inclusion is mainstream. However, when we look at the meanings associated with inclusions, we see that they're still somewhat flexible and evolving. Nonetheless, it's notable that many consumers are actually talking about the gap that exists between policy and programs and their real life experience. Furthermore, they are talking about everyday fairness, how to create that in routinized ways. As I said previously, small signals that indicate everyday versions of inclusivity. Right? So this has some implications for innovation. Right? So the shift from symbolic inclusion to embedded cultural influency has some meaning for us. And what I want to note here is this isn't just about messaging. While there's opportunity to change how we message things, this suggests that we need to think about how products are designed, merchandised, and brought into everyday life. First of all, what this tells us is we need to think about how to design products and experiences around real life behaviors, real life routines and situations, right? And in order to do that, we should think about what are the problems that people are trying to solve in their everyday life and what meaning does it carry? This suggests to me there's an opportunity here for what we might describe as contextual products. Products designed, as I said, around real life behaviors, routines, and cultural situations, right? So think, for example, of meal formats built for multi-generational households, spice levels or flavor layering that reflects regional cooking behaviors, products timed to culturally relevant events like Ramadan or Lunar New Year. I'll give you one example. It's a little bit older, but it's still highly relevant here. And that's the Nike Pro Hijab, right? So this was a performance apparel created by Nike in 2017. It was co-developed with athletes from Muslim majority countries. And it wasn't just about adding new athletes to their campaign. Instead, they redesigned performance apparel around breathability, movement, practicality, and importantly, modesty needs, right? So this wasn't just representation layered into an existing product. The cultural insight changed the product design itself. As I mentioned, this was launched in 2017. The line was expanded to include modest swimwear, suggesting that culturally relevant insights proved commercially durable. Now, the second implication here is to reduce friction. And I know that this isn't going to sound new or novel to anyone. We constantly hear consumers want less friction, there's cognitive overload, but here's where context matters, right? So in this context, in the context of inclusion, reducing friction to facilitate inclusion means removing the small barriers, the practical, social, or emotional barriers that make people feel excluded, unsupported, or unseen in everyday experiences, right? So consumers increasingly want to see evidence that brands and products create a sense of belonging and ease in their everyday lives. Let's think about this in the retail context, right? We see consumers starting to ask, can sales associates explain unfamiliar ingredients? Does assortment reflect local community demand? Are recommendations culturally aware rather than generic, right? And this is because it's about making life easier in the real world. I'll give you another example here to illustrate. Ulta Beauty is a great example of the shift from symbolic inclusion to embedded cultural fluency. Ulta didn't just they didn't just diversify their marketing imagery. Instead, they expanded their assortment for textured hair. They redesigned their associate training to ensure that anybody coming into the store, regardless of their skin tone or hair texture, could get great beauty advice. They invested in stylist education around different hair textures, and they changed how beauty expertise shows up in store to create a more inclusive environment for their customers. And lastly, build trust. Again, trust isn't novel, but in this context, there are some implications. And that's that credibility comes from participation and visibility. Consumers increasingly want to know who helped to shape this, whose perspective informed this new product or service. Was this designed with communities, or is it just being marketed to them? Right? So we're seeing brands start to test product with community creator networks or involve consumers earlier in flavor, format, or product decisions. And again, I'll give you another example of this. It's a fun one. It's Lego Ideas. This is where consumer can shape product decisions. They can submit product concepts. They have opportunities to vote on ideas, and their ideas shape product launches. So we see that trust increasingly comes from participation and transparency. All right, so that's one example. Let me give you a second example. And this is where we're seeing a shift from sustainability to resilience, right? And what's happening here, similarly, we have a loud conversation increasingly about backlash, skepticism, whether sustainability is realistic, performative, or always about greenwashing. However, when we look at consumers, we see that they're reframing sustainability through the lens of resilience, prioritizing reliability, durability, local sourcing, and everyday security over abstract environmental ideas. It's not a retreat from values. It's a shift in how responsibility is being interpreted under pressure, right? So in the past, sustainability was typically framed around reducing impact. It was about reducing our impact to do the right thing in the future, right? Now, increasingly, what we're seeing is a reframing doing the right thing as keeping daily life functioning in the face of instability. And this is showing up in how people talk about infrastructure, local sourcing, supply chains. And it's really interesting because they're not talking about supply chains in this abstract way. They're thinking about it in practical terms and how it impacts their daily reality. So again, it's not a rejection of sustainability, but it's a shift toward resilience as a more immediate and lived priority. Now, again, when we look at this intersection of sustainability and resilience in our maturity curve, the idea itself is very much mainstream. Similarly, the meanings that are associated with it are either mainstream or predicted to move into the mainstream as consumers increasingly believe that they need to manage uncertainty at the individual level. They're talking about having local control over important things like food and energy. And as I mentioned, they're talking about supply chains in ways that was unimaginable like 5 or 6 years ago. So again, we have some important implications for innovation, right? And the first is that consumers increasingly want dependable products that feel secure under pressure and aren't just environmentally responsible. This creates opportunities for things like longer life formats or longer shelf lives, low prep meals, flexible pantry products, locally sourced staples with fewer supply disruptions, products that work across multiple situations. I'll give you an example. It's more kind of a brand example, but I think it will bring this to life nonetheless, which is Costco. Costco is a great example of resilience as a brand strategy or a brand value. Consumers trust Costco because their core products are consistently available for the most part. Their pricing feels quite stable. There's opportunity for bulk purchasing, which reduces uncertainty, and private label products feel very dependable. It doesn't feel like consumers are being asked to trade quality for affordability. And during inflation and supply disruptions, this became a very large competitive advantage. And it's because consumers are looking to brands and retailers that reduce volatility and make their lives easier. My second implication here is that we need to think about how we can design for readiness. And this is because preparedness is becoming normalized in a quiet, kind of everyday way, right? So while there is absolutely an opportunity for things like emergency kits or emergency supplies, the bigger opportunity is in helping consumers feel more capable and less exposed in a volatile world through daily routines, right? So again, this might look like freezer-friendly batch prep formats, hydration, health, backup household products positioned around continuity. Even subscription models might become increasingly relevant to consumers in a world of uncertainty, right? But importantly, we need to be careful about positioning. We need to avoid fear-based positioning to really hone in on confidence, ease, and help consumers to feel a calm sense of confidence, right? So the brands that will win here will not make consumers feel alarmed. They'll help consumers feel prepared in an everyday way. Again, I'm going to give you an example. It might feel a little off at first, but bear with me. My example is a Stanley tumbler or a cup, right? Admittedly, Stanley cups aren't as popular as they once were. They were also quite popular because of the social capital they provided. But hear me out. They also offered people a sense of everyday preparedness. That is, had hydration readiness, they're portable, they're highly durable, and it was a symbol of always prepared behavior. In other words, it's resilience embedded into ordinary routines, which is what we're seeing as part of this shift. And then lastly, we need to design for dependability. As resilience becomes more important, consumers want proof that our systems are going to hold up. So this means transparency will shift from a sustainability claim to evidence of operational reliability, right? There's growing importance around things like traceable sourcing, visible local manufacturing, inventory transparency, backup supply strategies, and clear communication during any kind of disruption. So trust increasingly comes from seeing how a company manages instability, not just hearing its abstract values. And that changes how brands can communicate resilience from aspiration to demonstrated dependability, right? And this is all part of that shift from sustainability as a future responsibility to resilience as everyday continuity. All right. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. But before I wrap up, I do want to leave you with a few key takeaways. Off the top, the visible narrative tells us one thing, but the deeper meaning that we see through cultural analysis tells us something different. It tells us something deeper. And that distinction is really important in how we innovate, right? So first and foremost, what makes culture predictable is not visibility. It's the convergence that I talked about. A trend can generate a lot of attention very quickly, but that attention alone doesn't tell you whether or not something will last. What matters is when ideas stabilize and converge, whether people start to interpret an idea in a similar way and integrate it into everyday life, right? And so that's where innovation becomes less risky. Convergence helps us to predict what will scale. It's really important as we think about how we can use cultural insight in our innovation strategy. Convergence shows you where culture is actually moving. It predicts, as I said, what will scale. And finally, relevance is built into everyday systems. outcomes. We can't just focus on messaging and hope it will do all the work for us. We need to think about our cultural insight from the front end of innovation all the way throughout the innovation process, all the way to our go-to-market strategies. So I'm going to leave you with one question before I take your questions. And I want to ask you, how might you use this idea of cultural convergence in your upcoming business's challenges? And if that's something you'd like to talk about, I always invite you to reach out to us, and we can set up some time to further discuss how you might use cultural insight in your innovation strategy. Thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl. We will now be taking questions. You may have typed it on the presentation in the questions box. If we do not get to your question on this call, somebody from Lux will be in touch after the webinar. So let's take a look at to see if there's any questions in the questions box. Oh, here's an interesting one. What does this mean for companies that move slowly or rely on long innovation cycles? Any thoughts on this?
That's a great question. What I think is interesting here is, while we often point to shifts in meaning and change over time, I think what's also really interesting is where there's continuity and ongoing opportunity based on that continuity. So I think for businesses that are focused on a longer time span, or it takes longer to get to market, I think culture is still really important, because often our deep beliefs, our motivations, our values are quite sticky. They don't change quickly. They don't change at the pace of a viral meme. And as a result, I think it's a really good opportunity for some of those companies that do have that longer innovation window to continue to look at where there's continuity in culture, where there's convergence, and what that means in terms of what the opportunity is. And again, using the same principle to align innovation with consumers' deeper beliefs to ensure that we're also creating something that sticks or that lasts and is durable. I think in some instances, companies that have a longer innovation window, it may feel like it's a little bit easier in this day and age, but I think everyone is facing certain pressures from the speed at which culture moves, but understanding those deep beliefs is important, I think, both for understanding what's going to stay and what's going to change, and how we can use that in strategy. That's a good question.
That's great. And you mentioned convergence, and I see there's another question here on, can convergence ever reverse?
Yeah, oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. Like I said, meaning gets sticky because it's connected to the deep beliefs that we don't change typically in our lifetime. And once those meanings get embedded into systems, routines, infrastructure, reversal gets harder. So culture is sticky, which is why it's predictable and helpful. And that's where stabilization matters. But having said that, culture and meanings can reverse, especially if there are things like new products, new services that ask us or demand us to reevaluate what things mean in life. Similarly, we see a reversal in some instances when there's backlash, or we'll see a shift taking place when there's backlash. As I mentioned, fragmentation, multiple meanings gain traction in culture, or competing meanings. Sometimes we'll see there's a tension. For example, in wellness, wellness is very established as an idea, but if we look at it and we look at some of those deeper meanings, we start to see there is a tension and there's a bit of wellness fatigue at play. So I think, yes, convergence can reverse. We sometimes see things going backwards on our maturity curve, and it just indicates that there's growing fragmentation. And that's where our team of anthropologists are super helpful in understanding why. Why is that happening? What's leading to this? And again, what does that mean for our innovation strategy? Yeah, great question.
Yes, well, thank you very much. I think this This sums up our presentation, our webinar for today. The slide presentation and recording from this webinar will be sent to all attendees via email today. And after leaving the webinar, you will be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation, and we would appreciate any feedback you may have to help inform and improve future webinars. So take a moment and check out our upcoming webinars on our website. And thanks for joining us, and have a great day.